Welcome, everyone, and thank you for attending our webinar, Asian Americans from Allies to Accomplices. This program is dedicated to the life and legacy of the late, great Congressman John Lewis, who we lost last week.
Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe that we shall overcome someday.
I'm Ruth McMullin. I'm going to be your moderator and host for the evening. Our panelists include, or our esteemed panelists include, Mr. Don Tamaki. He's a founding member of StopRepeatingHistory.org, as well as one of the original lawyers on the Quorum Nobis team for the Fred Korematsu case. We also have joining us tonight Christopher Bruce, the political director for the ACLU. Azadeh Shahshahani, she is with Project South and also the previous president of the National Lawyers Guild. And rounding out our panelists is Professor Natsu Saito. She's an activist, an attorney, and a distinguished professor of law at Georgia State University College of Law. Thank you all for joining us. We've got a few photos to start with our speakers getting into some good trouble. So as your photos come up, why don't you tell us what you were doing in those photos to get into some good trouble? One photo is actually of me. That's my father and mother when we fled Vietnam. I was born in Vietnam and had to flee shortly after birth back to the United States. What's interesting about that is my father was born and raised in Birmingham, Alabama, and served 4 tours of duty in the Vietnam War and also 2 tours of duty in the Korean War. And growing up as a Black man in Alabama, he preferred to retire from the Army and move back to Vietnam to live, as opposed to coming back to Alabama. The only reason we ended up back in the United States at all is because Vietnam fell and the Americans and their families had to be evacuated. So that, I think, speaks to a lot of what was going on in the South in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And my father would rather live in a country that he just helped fight rather than come back to the United States. And the other picture is me learning how to get into good trouble. That's me and my co-intern, my second year of law school at the Southern Poverty Law Center, one of the many nonprofits that I interned at over the course of my law school career, and one of the big pivotal moments in my life that made me realize that nonprofit work is where I wanted to be.
Hello, my name is Don Tamaki. I'm so happy to be on this panel. Thank you for attending. I was one of the attorneys on Fred Korematsu's legal team, which in the 1980s, 38 years after the 1944 Supreme Court decision against him, reopened his case on the grounds of governmental misconduct involving the suppression, fabrication, and destruction of evidence in order to manipulate the outcome of these cases. So in the 1980s, we successfully reopened it. Before Fred passed away in 2005, we promised him when we reopened the case that win or lose the reopening, we would educate the country on what happened to him and also what happened to almost 120,000 Japanese Americans during World War II. Regrettably, the case is probably more relevant today than it was when we reopened his case in the 1980s.
Everyone, thank you. My name is Christopher Bruce. I am the political director for the ACLU of Georgia. As you can see in this picture, I'm glad that we're posting this one because this is about the ACLU's legal observing program, which really jumped off right after the first protests that were happening in the city of Atlanta. This picture is of a group, and you see the young Black men in the background. They got together in Marietta and they decided that they wanted to have a Black Lives Matter protest, something that was put on impromptu, but they got hundreds of people out there and they requested the help of the ACLU of Georgia. Now, typically I do not have a bullhorn or speak typically like what you have during other legal observing programs. But as John Lewis would say, you know, get in some good trouble. So I spoke because I also said the police should not be shooting Black people. So why can't I speak as well about the situation? So these are unprecedented times, and hopefully I can tell you more about the legal observing program later. Oh, this is another picture. The other thing that I want to say about those last pictures was the individuals that was in that picture, the head of it, he actually had the protest on his birthday, and he was only 20 years old. So he wasn't even 21 at the time. So these are good young people getting into good trouble.
Hi, everyone. My name is Azadeh Shahshahani with Project South and also the National Lawyers Guild. So there are two photos that you can see here. The one on the left, we're actually protesting during the summer of 2018, the Trump administration's family separations at the border and the caging of children and families. But also in Atlanta, we were protesting the fact that the city of Atlanta, despite saying that it was a welcoming place for immigrants, was actually spending millions of dollars or was profiting off of detention of immigrants to the tune of millions of dollars. And we pressed the mayor successfully to end that relationship and that collusion with ICE. So that immigrants are no longer detained at the Atlanta City Detention Center, and it looks like the facility is going to be shut down altogether. And then on the right-hand side, we are protesting the Muslim ban that went into effect in in January 2017, one of the first acts of the Trump administration. This protest is actually in DC. But I have to tell you that one of the most memorable moments that I've had in the past 3-4 years since the elections was actually at the protest in Atlanta on that weekend in January 2017, when I went to the airport as an Iranian American, very upset. Obviously, this ban affects my community. And was expecting to see maybe a couple hundred people, and then got there and there were thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people coming, including my own neighbors. And so that showed me that regardless of what happens, we're not going to be alone, and people are going to stick together and say no to the repression of this administration.
They came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Natsu Saito. I teach at Georgia State's Law School. I've been teaching courses on race and the law there for 25 years, as this says. My father's family was interned during World War II. And so ever since then, ever since I was conscious, I was aware of that injustice, and that really sort of tuned me into issues of race. And so since I've been in Atlanta, I have been involved with a wide range of issues for racial justice, starting in the 70s with attempts to integrate Georgia State University's the entire school, the entire system. We were trying to integrate other political activism in the 70s, including some work on prison cases and prison rebellions, which is really what made me decide to go to law school. This is one of the things I was involved with, was the efforts in Atlanta to try to get the city to take seriously the ongoing murders of young children, especially young Black boys in Atlanta in 1979 and 80. And some of y'all may have seen, there's a pretty good HBO documentary about it that's just come out.
Sorry. Thank you everyone for your introductions. I want to jump right into the discussion, starting with Don. Let's talk about basically what's the landmark case for Asian American activism, which is the fight to have the internment of Japanese Americans declared unconstitutional. I know we provided the audience with the documentary, The Alternative Facts, The Lives of the Executive Order 9066. Tell us about how you became part of that legal team to do the quorum nobis, the writ of quorum nobis.
Like Natsu's family, my family too was incarcerated during World War II. Let me frame the background a little bit differently to bring it up to modern times. One of the remarkable things about the Black Lives Matter movement is it really has shown a light on systemic racism, that is the culture of racism, and not just the outward manifestations. Those outward manifestations, for example, John Lewis fighting against legally enforced segregation, legally enforced voter suppression. Of course, the George Floyd torture murder, followed by the killings of Breonna Taylor, Eric Garner, Ahmaud Arbery, and so many others. The targeting of other people of color, Muslims, Latinx community members, immigrants, and certainly the Japanese American incarceration that Natsu had mentioned. So the Fred Korematsu case is normally associated with among the worst cases that the Supreme Court has ever decided, right up there with Dred Scott, Plessy versus Ferguson, and Korematsu versus the United States. They're really notorious cases. But what is not commonly known is that in what we've discovered in reopening Fred's case 38 years later, revealed a scandal of epic proportions involving at the highest levels of our government, the fabrication, suppression, and the destruction of evidence in order to manipulate the outcome of that landmark case. So by way of framing what happened, well, December 7th, 1941, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor. By February 19th, 1942, the president issues an executive order 9066, which puts the Western states under the command of a military general by the name of John L. DeWitt. He begins issuing military orders governing Japanese Americans, including curfew, couldn't leave the house after 8 a.m., had to stay there until 6. And within a couple of weeks later, those were followed by orders to report to assembly centers to be rounded up and incarcerated. So by the end of 1942, almost 120,000 Americans had lost their freedom, their property, and so on. So Fred Korematsu, a loyal American citizen born in California, challenged this as being unconstitutional. The government defended against Fred's challenge on two grounds. One, they claimed that Japanese Americans were spying. They were engaging in espionage and sabotage in the form of signaling enemy ships from shore. And the other argument was they're so different as a people. They speak a different language. They worship a different God. They're just not American. So therefore, they're not to be trusted. They're prone to disloyalty. And in 1944, when Fred's case went up to the Supreme Court, he thought he would win. To his surprise, he lost. In a 6-3 decision, Justice Hugo Black wrote, this is not a case of racial hostility against Japanese Americans. This is a case of military necessity. And because the government had invoked national security, who are we to question and second guess the judgment of the military? Well, that case stood for the next 38 years until researchers, Peter Irons and Aiko Yoshinaga Herzig, quite by accident, found secret FBI reports, reports from the Navy, reports with the Federal Communications Commission, all of which said that the claims that Japanese Americans were engaging in spying were, quote, intentional falsehoods, and that they posed no threat. And the Navy even said they should not have been removed. They should not have been incarcerated. The Attorney General.
Let me just interrupt. When you talk about Japanese American, you're talking about also, this included US born on American soil citizens, not just people who were here on some type of limited visa. These are natural born US citizens that were included in this order.
Yeah, in fact, 2/3 were born in this country. My mother and my father were born in the San Francisco Bay Area, and they were among, the 2/3 of them who were born American citizens. The rest of them could not naturalize by law. There were laws preventing immigrant Japanese from becoming citizens, and that was true also for immigrant Asian Americans. So when these cases came up before the US Supreme Court, the director of the Enemy Alien Control Project, a guy named Edward Ennis, was responsible for supervising the drafting of the brief. And he called up the reports in the FBI and the Navy and the Federal Communications Commission, expecting to see corroborating evidence that the Army says that Japanese Americans were spying. And to his shock, he found exactly the opposite. J. Edgar Hoover said, "We've investigated every single claim of short-of-ship signaling. None of it is true." The Navy recommended against the mass roundup even before it began. The Federal Communications Commission wrote back saying, "General DeWitt's men are picking up signals emanating from Tokyo and calling them short-of-ship transmissions." And so they were in ethical dilemma with Justice Department lawyers telling the Solicitor General, the Assistant Attorney General, and the Attorney General that they had a duty not to lie to the court. And even basically saying, we found memos saying that it occurs to me, General Edward Ennis writing, "It occurs to me that if we don't disclose the contents of the Navy's report, we're engaging in the suppression of evidence." At the end of the day, these whistleblowers tried to insert a footnote in the Korematsu brief, basically saying that the Army's claims were contradicted by the government's own intelligence reports. The War Department and the Solicitor General found out about the footnote. They literally ordered the printing press to stop for the brief. The footnote was deleted, and in its place with another one basically said, "We have in our possession reports corroborating the Army's claims." So strong was this culture of racism that even in the face of facts and the Constitution, that culture of racism persisted. And the result was a civil liberties disaster. And so the lesson of the case, the Korematsu case, is when no one is watching, when the courts are looking the other way, when the public is looking the other way and not asking any questions, terrible things can happen. And in January of 2017, Trump issues the first of thrice revised Muslim bans, banning travel from Muslim majority countries. And at that time, the legal team thought that here was a chance for the Supreme Court to revisit its error in Korematsu versus the United States and once and for all officially overturn that terrible judgment. I'm going to leave it up to Azadeh to explain what happened in that case. But suffices to say that history is repeating itself.
And that's a great segue into Azadeh. Azadeh, can you tell us how you first responded when you heard about the talk of the Muslim ban and Trump's executive order banning the nationals from Iran, Iraq, Syria, and other Muslim countries?
Right, and thank you very much, Dawn, for that powerful discussion that you just laid out. So yeah, as I mentioned, we all showed up to the airport outraged, including Representative John Lewis, who basically, along with Representative Hank Johnson, showed up to the airport, as you can see in this photo, and refused to leave until there was information about, folks from Atlanta who had gone abroad to visit family or just on a trip, and because of Trump's decision, a stroke of Trump's pen, had just been told that they couldn't go back home. They were basically detained at the airport, and the lawyers were at the airport, but the officials there refused to provide any information, and so that's how Representative Hank Johnson and John Lewis were notified, and they showed up and sat there and refused to leave. And the following day, Representative John Lewis also came to the protest, and we spotted him in the crowd and requested that he speak to the crowd, and he said, no, I just want to be among the crowd. So that's, the kind of person that he was, with dignity, that obviously, he wasn't there as a politician trying to get attention, rather to be there as part of the crowd. And so, the ban was challenged in many, many court decisions. There were some successful ones, but unfortunately, once it got to the Supreme Court, it was upheld. The Supreme Court, at the same time as it struck down the Korematsu decision, upheld the Muslim ban, which was an extremely shameful decision. And hopefully at some point in the future, another court will recognize it for the racist, wrong decision that it is, and will strike down the Muslim ban.
I think so. Well, I think that's a good place. We can talk about some of the correlations between what the Executive Order 9066 did to the Japanese versus the Executive Order and the Muslim ban. There seemed to be no regard for citizenship. There seemed to be no regard for any actual acts to harm or do any harm to the United States, or any threat, any actual threat. It just seems like a broad, sweeping ban based on either national origin or religion. So were there any other parallels between the two, Azadeh or Don?
Yeah, go ahead,
Sorry.
Don.
Well, the parallels between the Korematsu case and the Muslim ban are just startling. They're disturbing. Both arose out of war. Both involve the government invoking national security in order to shield its decisions from any judicial scrutiny. Both involve the targeting of a besieged minority, Japanese Americans during World War II, the Muslims, as part of a campaign promise that Trump made to shut down the borders. Both involve hidden government intelligence reports that the government refused to disclose, even when requested to do so by the lower courts. And sadly, both ended with the courts standing down, abdicating their constitutional role to ask probing questions. And I think the startling thing, the founders understood without three branches of government, each being a check and balance on the other, it's really designed to thwart the rise of kings and tyrants. And without any check, one branch or the other can just go out of control and threaten democracy itself. So that was a sad thing that I think, Azadeh, you mentioned this, that Korematsu should have been overruled. And what happened essentially is they took the worst elements of the Korematsu case and imported it into a new vessel. And that principle is, when the government invokes national security, the court isn't going to ask any questions. And we think that's a dangerous, dangerous precedent.
And I want to move to Natsu and talk about, other examples of the government, especially the federal government, using national security or some other source of sovereign power to then discriminate. I know our U.S. history is full of at the national and the state level. So can you give us some examples of that?
Yes, it's happened at every turn where national security has been invoked. In that, with respect to immigration matters, the government often relies on what's called the plenary power doctrine. And the plenary power doctrine says that the courts will simply abdicate responsibility to the, quote, political branches of government, the Congress and the executive. And we've seen the plenary power doctrine invoked in cases where the government claims it is some sort of outside or foreign fear, right? But we see it being invoked with respect to American Indians, who are identified as outsiders, as savage, as foreign. And that's what, to this day, allows the government complete control over Indian affairs. We see it invoked in the immigration context, starting with the Chinese Exclusion Act. And again, it was the hordes of Chinese were going to come and take over. And that's why still today we can have the Muslim ban, we can have kids in cages at the border. And we see it also invoked with respect to external territories, colonies of the United States, like Puerto Rico. So in all these cases, the fear of some kind of external threat is invoked to completely eviscerate any constitutional protections or any protections under international treaties that might exist.
Thank you. And, talking about, not just external, Chris, I know that you've been active with providing observer training for the local protests. It kind of feels like internally within the United States borders, our own Native people, born and raised, are being treated like the outside enemies and the threats. So, what are some of the biggest issues that the ACLU has been dealing with recently, in addition to the protests that have been going on across the nation?
Sorry, my internet went out real fast. That was a question for me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. As you know, there's a lot of things that happened with George Floyd, the murder of him, the murder of Ahmaud Arbery, and the murder of Breonna Taylor and Rayshard Brooks. But pointing out, Breonna Taylor's, her killers are still out there right now. So these are happening in different places at different times. And I'll tell you what's been going on in Georgia. I remember when Ahmaud Arbery was murdered on February 23rd of 2012. And the reason why I remember 2020, and the reason why I remember that is because I remember Trayvon Martin being murdered on February 26th of 2012. And I also remember being a law student at that time, really thinking about the situations and going down to Sanford, Florida, and now going down to Brunswick. I see this as a continuous effort for us to fight for civil rights amongst all of us, because we're really not thought of as human beings when it comes to people of color altogether. So when Ahmaud Arbery was happening and George Floyd had died Memorial Day, I was going to Minneapolis to help out the ACLU of Minnesota, help out with protecting people's rights when it came to protesting. And at that time, when I was coming back, I had actually booked a flight to go to Minneapolis, but then I decided on not doing that because I saw the eruption that was happening in Atlanta. So I said, I can't go there while my own city is in turmoil. So I got back that night and linked up with individuals from the National Lawyers Guild for legal observation, and started a partnership with them, who was going to train some of our members into becoming legal observers, because we know that there were a lot of police officers who are actually who are going to be above and beyond their duty to quell protests or intimidate protesters. So unfortunately, those two individuals from the National Lawyers Guild were arrested. And they were arrested doing what they do best, which is legal observation. So we had to start up a legal observation program off the cuff. And luckily there was a lot of interest from our members and other volunteers, especially lawyers, to the point where we trained over 1,000 people in 3 days to be out there at the front lines in Atlanta, watching the police and making sure that we're protecting the rights of protesters. So we observed a lot of things that were happening, and we're not the only ACLU affiliate that's done this. Once we had people in those blue vests out there, the amount of tear gas incidents went down, it plummeted. The amount of incidents of rubber bullets being used by the National Guard and police officers plummeted. There were a decreasing amount of arrests that were happening there. And we've been through it all, and we're still out there. So we were there during the CNN protests. We were there during the daily protests that were happening. And there are still protests happening. When the Wendy's was getting burned down and people hopped on Highway 85, I was on the highway with them. It's still a moment that I'll remember to this day. And the latest one that we actually did was with a candlelit march for John Lewis that happened after he died. We had legal observers there making sure that this peaceful observance of John Lewis's life was upheld peacefully as well.
Well, that brings me to, Azadeh, having been the president of the National Lawyers Guild, can you talk about, what's going on in Portland right now? With, again, we have the federal government, the reports on the news. And so we know that what we hear in the news is probably a small fraction of what's actually happening on the ground. But the news is reporting federal agents grabbing people, taking them into custody. I don't care what they call it. They're taking them into custody with no explanation, with no discussion, and taking them away from the protest. So what's going on, what's going on there, and how can people get involved or help?
Right, thank you. So just maybe a couple words about the National Lawyers Guild. It's an organization that was formed in 1937 as the first integrated bar association, because at the time the American Bar Association did not allow Black attorneys to become members. So the National Lawyers Guild, basically the membership is lawyers, law students, and legal workers. And mass defense is a big part of our work, and the legal observer program. I'm sure folks have seen the National Lawyers Guild legal observers in the green neon hats. And the purpose is to be there to monitor police abuse. As you can see, the green hats. And, unfortunately, NLG legal observers in Atlanta, including across the country, were also arrested, even though they're not, legal observers are not part of the protest, they're actually monitors. But here in Atlanta, the chair of the National Lawyers Guild Georgia chapter was arrested and held in jail overnight. And so that was, pretty outrageous action. In terms of Portland, so based on reporting from the nation, the unidentified federal agents were actually with the Custom and Border Protection, which, brings huge, problems to the fore. I mean, we know that Custom and Border Protections has a very well-documented history of atrocities, including murders and holding of kids in cages that led to the deaths of children who were, left in freezing cells. And so this agency, which is extremely unaccountable, is now basically kidnapping people off the streets. I mean, I'm not sure if folks have seen the videos. There are like unmarked cars that people are being dragged into, and there is no information provided as to where people are going, who are these agents, who are they accountable to. And so the National Lawyers Guild actually recently put out a hotline number ensuring that folks across the country, as the federal law enforcement is now being sent to even more cities, including Seattle, Chicago, and elsewhere in the country, that people should be able to call this hotline number and report instances of FBI door knocks, subpoenas, and other types of repression by the federal government now that people are on the streets and toppling the statutes of the Confederacy and fighting racism. And so, I think just continuing to stay vigilant, knowing that there are legal activists out there trying to protect the rights of activists is really important.
Don and Professor Natsu, Georgia finally passed a hate crimes legislation. What are your thoughts on that in terms of whether it's effective? And Chris, feel free to chime in too. I know the ACLU was a big part of trying to get something passed, because Georgia had nothing and was one of the few states that had nothing. But where do you see the hate crimes legislation going from here?
Maybe I can just comment and then defer to both Chris and Natsu. I think from a cultural standpoint, I'm from California. There have been hate crime legislations, and in particular, enforcement mechanisms within district attorneys, prosecutors' offices in various counties. That wasn't always the case. And what's happened is a shift in the culture. This is not to say that hate crimes do not happen on the West Coast or in California, But before, again, this culture of racism, systemic racism, contributes to a sense that this thing is kind of normal, that, you know, the killings that have happened in police brutality matters barely have evoked a shrug, even though one after another has occurred. And it's important to shift that dynamic. And part of it was an effort, at least on the West Coast, to pass legislation to raise the issue, shine a light on what's going on, to make folks understand it is not normal. And facts do matter, and the law matters. And crimes that are motivated by race and hatred toward religion, race, or other status crimes really need to be brought to the forefront if we are to be a diverse society. So I'm going to defer to Natsu and Chris to talk about what's going on in Atlanta.
Well, I'll defer to Chris about the specific legislation here. I just wanted to throw in that I think on these matters, it is really important to point out the extent to which racialized violence against individuals by authorities, state authorities, and also by individuals is so pervasive. And it's important to try to get legislation to combat that. We also have to be vigilant, I think, because a lot of times these statutes are worded in a facially neutral manner, and then we find them being used against people of color as if attempts to defend communities of color are the equivalent of acts of white supremacy. And I just think that that's something we really have to pay a lot of attention to, because these things are not equivalent. And we see, you know, at a federal level, we fairly recently saw attempts to equate what they called Black identity extremism with white supremacy. And really all that was doing was saying, if you act in a manner designed to protect the Black community, right? If you identify as a Black person in defending your community, that can equate you to a domestic terrorist. And so, you know, there's just dangerous ways in which these concepts can be taken. And I'm not disagreeing at all with anything Don just said, but we just have to be really vigilant that we remember that race consciousness is not necessarily the problem. It's the attempt to impose oppression or domination on people on the basis of race that's the problem.
So, Professor, you know, your example is basically, I mean, to put it in, I guess, in a picture form, someone engaging in a Black Lives Matter protest could be labeled a domestic terrorist, whereas the Klan has never been labeled as domestic terrorists, even though they've murdered and killed thousands of people.
Yes, and to some extent, I guess that's the other side of this, is that, again, while it's very important to condemn acts of racism, right? We have to do that, and we have to try to get teeth into those laws, anti-racist laws. We have to remember that it's not, you know, there is not that equivalency, and also not to use that framing to say this is a matter of individual attitudes or personal hatred, right? That's one of the issues I have with sort of calling these hate crimes, because it goes way beyond our personal feelings, right? To the structural systemic nature of racism in the society, and the fact that it permeates all of these institutions to the point where, you know, we could have everybody not feeling personally hateful of anybody else, and the racism would persist.
So, Chris, I think that brings me to you, and specifically to the legislation that was finally passed in Georgia. You know, tell us about your efforts in that, and, you know, where we still have to go, because I think that we all agree that there's still much more to do for Georgia.
Oh, absolutely. And I want to continue on what the professor was saying. One of the reasons why the ACLU of Georgia never took a stance on hate crimes is because of the issues that you do have in legislation and what we've seen in other areas. There have been times that hate crime statutes have been used against people of color. And why? Because we have a criminal justice system that was not set up for people of color. So being very careful within that, knowing that you have mandatory minimums or mandatory sentence enhancements that are happening within there that could, again, be used against people of color is one form or fashion of it. But we were within those conversations of saying, if you're going to pass a hate crime statute, let's figure out where the hate's at, okay? There were 9 jurisdictions in 2018 in Georgia that reported what we would call hate crimes or hate crime investigation. 9 jurisdictions, police jurisdictions. There are 470 police jurisdictions in the state of Georgia. That does not mean that hate crimes only happens in Metro Atlanta or those 9 jurisdictions. It only means that the police were mandated to report hate crimes in those jurisdictions. And that's why you needed a hate crimes law, mostly towards finding out where the hate really is. So we know that there are white extremist organizations all throughout the state of Georgia. Let's find out where those are, report that to the federal government, which has a hate crimes act that goes to the US attorney and the FBI that can properly monitor these areas that are terrorizing Black communities. And let's not forget, this is not just a response of Ahmaud Arbery. Within that culture that we're talking about, in 1863, our citizens arrest law was passed as a direct result of slaves leaving the South to the North, but you no longer had a law patrol or a slave patrol anymore because everyone's focused on the Civil War. So then it was used, the citizens arrest law was used to capture slaves, or even after the Civil War, capture Black people, especially Black men, put them in chains in the justice system, and then put them on chain gangs and make them do the same hard labor that they were doing in with slavery. In fact, there were some places where they were in worse conditions. So that's the next step, really. It's really finding out the other laws that were here, like the citizens arrest statute, that emboldened the McMichaels of hunting down and murdering Ahmaud Arbery. That's where we need to go. And they're having hearings right now, like on August 3rd, about the citizens arrest statute.
You know, Chris, you brought up a good point, which is, you know, the data keeping and the mandatory reporting of the crimes. But, you know, getting back to Don's whole organization, Stop Repeating History, I'm kind of skeptical about trusting the government to keep the statistics and keep the information honestly and accurately. You know, Don, are there some other avenues that agencies can use to report or maybe fact check what's being kept by the, you know, the FBI and these other government agencies?
Well, there are various organizations, including, I think, the ACLU, who are, and certainly Asian Law Caucus, Advancing Justice, other organizations that are keeping data with respect to Asian Americans. I suspect there are other private nonprofits doing the same thing. But I think overall it's a good thing. I realize that these things can be turned around and used in the way that they were never intended. But on the whole, I think it's a good idea because it helps turn the culture, which I think is the problem. I mean, if the lesson of Fred Korematsu and the other cases have taught us anything, it basically means that if the culture is a lock 'em up culture, the facts don't matter and the law doesn't matter. And even people trying to reveal the facts before the US Supreme Court at the highest levels are gonna fail because the culture doesn't support that. If the culture supports slavery, and that's a normal course of events, then everything else doesn't matter. So I think ultimately it's changing hearts and minds. When we reconvened the Korematsu case, remember we reopened these cases in the 1980s, Gordon Hirabayashi, Minoru Risui, and Fred Korematsu. We reconvened them after the Trump travel ban because we saw the same issues repeating itself. We did file an amicus brief in a losing effort that Azadeh mentioned, 5-4 decision. But we also said, we need to do everything we can to educate the public of what is going on. Because if the courts are not going to play their constitutional role of being a check, asking probing questions, when the government makes sweeping policies depriving people of fundamental freedoms, then this is how dictators get started. So it really is up to everyday people to start questioning what is going on. So we started a public awareness campaign called Stop Repeating History. But within all that, there are myriad of things to do, including private nonprofits, for example, Judge, that are keeping data, keeping statistics, and pushing them at the local level. I think change is local. So with respect to things that people can do on the ground, I think that's essential, whether it's this kind of data tracking, poll observers, protest observers, all of these things are very important at the local level.
And Azadeh, we actually have a question in our chat room, and I think this is a perfect segue into something you can possibly answer. The question is from Matt A, and his question is, I work for a tech company that is considering becoming more active in filing or joining amicus briefs. And how much do you think the Muslim ban amicus briefs, especially the ones signed by 100 tech companies, affected court decisions? Or do you feel like the amicus briefs from the technology companies helped at all?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think all of those efforts are effective, and, folks should continue to do that and contribute in that way. I also think just, we need a groundswell of opposition to racist laws, including the Muslim ban. So, one piece of positive news is that thanks to years of organizing and advocacy, finally the US House last week actually passed the No Ban Act, which was, it's a great development. I mean, of course, it's not going to go anywhere in the Senate, but just, a step in the positive direction. And I think, I was speaking about this when I got disconnected thanks to the internet. In terms of people's tribunals, so in Georgia, once we found out that, Supreme Court hearing on the Muslim ban was going to be postponed in October or September of 2017, we actually got together and organized our own tribunal, the People's Tribunal. The model was actually the Russell Tribunal. That was the first People's Tribunal looking at the US government's crimes in Vietnam. And ever since then, there have been many People's Tribunals held around the world and here in the US. And so this one that we organized, there was a jury of community members and the prosecution and the defense, but the most important part of the tribunal, as it is always, was the witnesses. So community members and organizations who were being impacted and continue to be impacted by the Muslim ban talked about the damage that this ban is doing, the family separation. And so then, after hearing out the witnesses, the jury deliberated for a few hours and came back with a verdict of guilty against the Muslim ban and against the Trump administration for egregious human rights violations and civil rights violations. And so that's something that could be replicated. That could be replicated around the country. Even when there are not judicial fora available for people, folks can organize their own people's tribunals just so we can make sure that these human rights violations are documented, and hopefully a court down the line will in fact strike down the Muslim ban.
And one more, I guess, one other area I want to touch on before we start talking about the takeaways is, I guess we'll start with you, Natsu. Given this whole pandemic that we're in right now, I know we've seen examples of the rise in anti-Asian sentiment again and violence, actual violence towards Asian Americans. What policies do you see impacting Asian Americans right now coming from the federal government?
Well, in terms of policies, I'm not sure that the policies themselves are the problem so much as Don was talking about the culture that's being promulgated. right? The portrayal of, you know, the notion that the coronavirus is somehow a Chinese virus, which of course is reminiscent again of history repeating itself. We see that going all the way back to the Chinese Exclusion Act and then to the portrayal of Asians, Japanese Americans. We see, you know, when the United States was waging a war of so-called pacification in the Philippines in order to colonize it, you know, Filipinos being portrayed this way. All it evokes all of those kinds of images, and it supports the notion that we have a virus being an external enemy with the face of Asian peoples on it. And so then that empowers the government to try to mobilize fear and hatred and insecurity against human beings instead of trying to mobilize people in a positive way to actually prevent, you know, the disease.
So, you know, as we start to, you know, come to a close, I'd like each of our panelists to give our attendees some, I guess, action items, things that they can do for the lawyers and the non-lawyers on how to get yourself into good trouble, ways that they can be active, whether they're in a big firm, a small firm, whether they're already in, you know, a nonprofit or private practice, or whether they're not lawyers at all. What are some things that people can do in the coming months to continue to not just be an ally, but to actually be an actionable ally or an accomplice in fighting the systemic racism? Who wants to start? Chris?
Happy to start, actually. And first, I want to say thank you again for having me on this great panel with so many learned individuals. I've learned a lot. I hope the people who are joining in have learned a lot as well. And this is where you begin as far as activism. The ACLU of Georgia is launching a poll worker recruitment program. In fact, we've already launched. We all know what happened on June 9th.
Yeah.
Georgia became the laughingstock of the nation again when it came to voting. So now, instead of pointing fingers and everything else and dealing with politics, ACLU of Georgia has said, you know what? We are going to launch a program where communities are now taking over these polling precincts. The last person to vote in the state of Georgia was at 12:36 a.m. That is ridiculous when polls close at 7 p.m. So we want that polling precinct where we had all those problems and put them up with staff from ACLU or volunteers and members, people that don't only go through the Board of Elections training, but ACLU will provide additional training as well to make sure they're well equipped to deal with whatever situations that are happening. So again, that's good trouble in honoring John Lewis. I had the honor of being CT Vivian's pallbearer during his lay in wait at the Capitol. Now we know John Lewis is coming back. I can find really other fitting moments to do this, but if this speaks to your heart, then join us. Be on the front lines of protecting people's right to vote in the state of Georgia.
Don?
Well, I guess what I'd like people, the takeaway for me is that this is not only systemic racism and specific attacks against African Americans or Asian Americans or the immigrant community. What we are watching that I've never seen before in my lifetime is the hollowing out of democracy. So the playbook that's being used is been around since time immemorial, and it's used globally. And that is, one, appeals to prejudice, two, engage in fear mongering and scapegoating, whoever the population is, and third, engage in false narratives, alternative facts, so to speak, just fabricated information to achieve a political agenda, an agenda that is intended to maintain the status quo, keep voters suppressed, undermine other communities. So I think the first thing is to educate ourselves and be aware of that. As far as what lawyers can do and what just whether you're a lawyer or not can do, it's just myriad. I mean, basically write a check to the candidate of your choice. Support policies that promote voting. Be active in the public schools and the curriculum that is being taught. There's lots to do with respect to challenging the status quo that has viewed this situation as being normal. You know, it's the jargon now is being anti-racist, and that means examining at every level and at every dinner table conversation what it means to have a culture like this. And I think that's the way that real change actually happens. Then laws, court decisions, and other things follow that wave.
And Natsu, you know, I wanted to ask you when Don's talking about being more aware of what's being taught in our schools, you know, that's a slow process, and that's actually, you know, a local and state issue in terms of changing the narrative that's taught in schools. What are some sources, or do you have some resources that we can use as parents and as people who want to learn more to educate ourselves and our family members about what the real history, not the whitewashed version that we learn in schools? You know, and I know that when we learned about the internment in history in Alabama, I am most certain that it was taught to us with the view of this was a good and necessary thing.
Well, there are lots of great resources out there. There's a lot of resources on Asian American history that for those of us who are Asian Americans, we can certainly start with. There's great resources on the history of immigration. What I found when I started trying to understand the internment and my own family's experiences, I found that, you know, I couldn't understand what had happened to Japanese Americans without understanding this broader history of Asian Americans. And then I couldn't understand that unless I looked at what had been happening to Black folks in this country for, you know, more than 400 years. And then I couldn't understand that without understanding the history of indigenous peoples on this continent for the past 500 years. And I feel that, of course, you know, also this applies to issues of Latinx peoples and to white folks, right? None of our histories can be understood in isolation, and none of them can be understood unless we look at the ongoing illegal occupation of this continent and ongoing colonization of indigenous peoples and therefore all the rest of us. And to me, that says that we need to see all of our struggles as personal struggles, right? As struggles that, you know, they're not somebody else's struggles, because all of our struggles tie together in this manner, and we're not any of us going to be liberated unless we all are, which sounds kind of trite, but I think it's really true in terms of taking it back to the roots. And for me, the best way to understand the ongoing systemic racism is to understand the United States as a settler colonial state, a place where the colonizers came to stay. And you don't have to have a lot of fancy education to just think about the fact that where does racism come from? Those early colonizers had to portray American Indians in a negative racialized way in order to justify taking the land. And then if they wanted to make profit off that land, they had to portray people of African descent as animals and as, you know, in other denigrating racialized ways in order to make it profitable. And if they wanted cheap disposable labor, they had to do that with Asians and with Mexicans, et cetera, right? So all of the ways, the types of racism that we are struggling with have certain functions in this society, and they're kind of common sense functions if you stop and think about it. You know, it helps to read history, but I think most of us, you know enough history that if we really stop to think about the whys of racism in this country, we'll see that all of our situations are are integrally and really organically tied together. And to me, that's how we can, if we just keep that in mind every time we see something happening around us, which we see happening every day in some form or another, and we call it out and we act on it as if it were personal.
Azadeh, sorry, moving to you, Azadeh. In addition to educating ourselves about our history and, putting forth more effort into voting rights, what are some areas where other areas that our attendees can get involved in? I tell everyone that systemic racism really is just that. It's system-wide. Every system, everywhere, there's something to do. If voting rights is not your thing, then there may be another issue. What are the most pressing issues you see coming from Project South?
Yeah. So I would say, make sure to support local grassroots organizations. There is no need to reinvent the wheel. Probably, what you're interested in doing, there is already a local organization that is doing that work. So, find out what those organizations are, approach them and see in what ways you can support them, financially, legally, or otherwise. Especially there is a need to support organizations that are Black-led or, led by folks of color. And for lawyers, as we've seen over the summer, in the next few months, around the elections, I'm sure there's going to be people on the streets organizing, mobilizing, and there is going to be a need for legal support. So please, join or approach organizations such as the National Lawyers Guild, see how you can support folks through serving as a legal observer, through trying to get somebody out of jail, advising people on what their rights are on interactions with the police, and just providing legal support in other ways, because, we hopefully there's going to be a lot of organizing happening in the next few months and onwards, and movements, people-led movements are always in need of legal support.
We have one question. This Judge Wong, says Alvin T. Wong. There's a question, and I'll let anyone answer it who thinks you can. It's on the Portland federal agents issue. The question is, I understood the federal judge out there refused to issue a restraining order to stop the arrest. Is this true, and how can that be? Stranger things have happened.
So I believe the latest I understand, which was the decision that I saw was that the federal court had said that the Attorney General does not have a standing, and it is in fact very troubling in terms of the power that the feds are exercising, basically roaming around and kidnapping people off the streets. And so hopefully there will be future legal actions. I hope that is going to restrain some of these abuses by the federal agents. Otherwise, we could see them on the streets of all of our cities.
Can I say one thing sort of tagging on to that, which is that I really think it's important as lawyers, well, as anybody, to remember that resistance is never futile. That all of the changes that we've seen in this country have come about because of resistance, and that for lawyers, it's really important to remember that even though in many cases, as Justice John Marshall said, these are the courts of the conqueror, nonetheless, sometimes we can really effect important change through the courts, and that we have to remember not to give in to the notion that we can't accomplish something in the courts. And I think Don's Exhibit A in this respect, right? The Quorum Nobis cases were cases that any sort of smart lawyer would have said, oh, that's impossible, you can't do that, right? But they won. And it's only by taking on those challenges as lawyers that we bring change.
I would say one other thing, if I could, Judge, to add to that. We're watching other things more broadly undermine democracy. I mean, dissenters being shouted down, whistleblowers being retaliated against. the press being called the enemy of the people. And now we have unnamed, camouflaged federal agents sweeping through some of these communities and literally picking people up. I mean, it exemplifies really how fascist regimes start. And I don't think that's an exaggeration. And as lawyers in particular, we need to be mindful of that. Anybody who takes the oath to uphold the Constitution and the rule of law, you know, we take that seriously. And so that sometimes can manifest itself in speaking out and doing legal action. But other times it's just helping to lead our local community, that this is not America. This is not the America we want. And I think members of the audience can lead their own local community in that effort in recognizing what is going on.
Well, you know, I want to round it out. My recommendation is working with electionprotection.org. You don't have to be a lawyer. They will train you to do election day monitoring. And I tell people, if you're serious about this, and especially for my lawyers out there, go ahead and put your leave of absence in now for election day. So that way you can actually be off and volunteer. That's something we often miss. And, you know, I know that courts are closed for the most part, but if they reopen, you want to make sure your leave is in so you're free to volunteer. For non-lawyers, electionprotection.org, they need people of all backgrounds. They have a hotline in multiple languages on election day. You can work in your local area volunteering to go to the polls near you. You can volunteer working on the phones. You can volunteer as a lawyer at the law firm in their command office working on emergency motions. There's something for everyone in election protection. And I think to hone in on what everyone's saying, local elections matter. Get involved. And another thing that we need a lot is, you know, we need more of us running for office, more people of color, any color running for office. The perspective changes when we have a difference. And, you know, I want to kind of close this out thanking our panelists. You guys are amazing. You're inspiring. There's so much that we all still have to learn about our own histories, about the history of our country. And, you know, there's so much more to do, and I'm sure we're going to have more of these panels in the future, but we want to close this out with Don Tamaki introducing a video. This video is specially produced for the Asian Americans from Allies to Accomplices. And, you know, Don, if you want to introduce the video, and we'll be happy to play it. It's a fantastic video, and thank you everyone for your participation.
Thank you, Judge. You know, it was produced from a perspective of Asian Americans, this video. It's only a minute, but it can apply to every one of us. And we know something about what is going on in our own history. So I think the message is for the panel, let's not be bystanders to history. I mean, we're watching something that has not been seen in this country for 50 years. And, you know, we need to be involved in it one way or another in big and small ways. With respect to Asian Americans, I think we could say we have skin in this game. You know, the original travel ban was the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. We know what it's like to be separated, having children separated from their parents. We know what it's like to be locked up. Asian Americans did not go through 300 years of slavery, but we do know what it's like to be targeted. And so this video is a message that we need to stand together. We need to be in allyship with Black Lives Matter, and we need to lead our own communities and be an integral part in this rebirth, I think, of a new civil rights movement. So with that, if you can roll the video, it speaks for itself.
We cannot walk alone. We must make the pledge that we shall always march ahead.
We want justice for Black families.
Because they marched, America became more free and more fair. not just for African Americans, but for women and Latinos, Asians and Native Americans. America changed for you and for me.
No justice, no peace. No justice, no peace. No justice, no peace. No justice, no peace. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I can't breathe.
No, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream.
Thank you, everyone. This was great. This was recorded on the GAPABA Facebook page, and it's streamed live. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So keep fighting the good fight and keep getting into good trouble.
Okay, trouble. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Much obliged.